on the 18th of July 1906 in a tall townhouse at Carlton House Terrace overlooking St James's Park. A woman who had once worn a gown stitched with peacock feathers and beetle wing emeralds lay dying in a room with the curtains half drawn against the London summer heat. She was 36 years old. 2 specialists had been summoned that afternoon when her breathing changed, and they stayed until the end, though there was nothing left for medicine to do. At 20 minutes to 6 in the evening, her heart simply stopped. The man who had built an empire's pageantry around her, who had dressed her in jewels meant to dazzle 2 continents, who had made her the second most powerful woman in the British Empire after the Queen herself, was holding her hand when she died. He would spend the rest of his life trying to build her a monument worthy of the one she had already given him, and he would not finish it for 7 years. This is the story of Mary Leiter, the Chicago merchant's daughter who became Baroness Curzon of Kedleston, Vicereine of India, and the most famous American woman of her age, and of how the very brilliance she lent to her husband's ambitions became the thing that quietly killed her. Welcome. Mary Victoria Leiter was born in Chicago on the 27th of May 1870, 1 year before the fire that would nearly erase the city of her birth. Her father, Levi Ziegler Leiter, was a self-made man in the truest American sense. A bookkeeper of Swiss-German Mennonite stock, who had partnered with a traveling salesman named Marshall Field to found a dry goods business that would grow, through ambition and considerable luck, into one of the great mercantile fortunes of the Gilded Age. When the Great Fire of 1871 destroyed their store, the 2 men lost the equivalent of $2.5 million in goods, yet managed to reopen within 18 months. And Levi Leiter had the foresight to begin buying up scorched real estate at bargain prices while the city was still smoking, a decision that would make the Leiter name synonymous with wealth for the next generation. By 1881, when Mary was 11, the family had left Chicago for Washington, D.C., where her father's growing fortune bought them entry into a different kind of society altogether, not merely rich, but proximate to power. They settled first into the former home of the politician James G. Blaine on DuPont Circle, before moving into a grander house of their own, and the family also kept a summer residence at Lake Geneva of Wisconsin, where Mary earned the nickname, the Lake Geneva Princess. It was a childhood built for display, a girl meant to be educated, polished, and eventually married well. She was taught dancing, singing, music, and art at home by private tutors, and learned French from a governess brought over for the purpose. Her education was not entirely ornamental, though a professor from Columbia University was engaged to teach her history, arithmetic, and chemistry, subjects considered too rigorous for most girls of her class and era. Mary Leiter, even as a child, was being prepared for something more than a decorative life. Whether anyone intended it that way is harder to say. But the effect was the same, a young woman who could charm a drawing room and also hold her own in a serious conversation, a rare combination in 1880s Washington. She grew into a striking young woman, tall, by the standards of the day, unusually, and the kind of beauty that drew comment wherever she went. She counted among her close friends the young First Lady Frances Folsom Cleveland, only a few years her senior, and moved easily among the capital's most established families. By the time she was 18, she was by most accounts the most talked about debutante in Washington. And here is the first small telling detail worth holding on to. Mary Leiter was, almost from girlhood, described by everyone who met her not as loud or showy, qualities expected of new American money trying to prove itself, but as serious, studious, reserved in a way that drew people toward her rather than away. It was an unusual temperament for an heiress of the Gilded Age, and it would matter enormously later, when the role she was asked to play required exactly that kind of quiet, costly endurance. There was, even then, a single object that would follow Mary through the rest of her life, reappearing at the most important moments like a refrain. A piece of jewelry, a diamond, a glittering thing meant to be looked at rather than worn for comfort. As a girl, she was already dressed for effect at her parents' table, seated beside foreign dignitaries her father had cultivated as friends. The habit of being looked at, of being in some sense an asset on display, was something Mary Leiter learned before she ever crossed the Atlantic. It would follow her all the way to a peacock feathered gown in a palace in Delhi, and it would follow her finally into a marble tomb designed expressly to be looked at for centuries. But that comes later. Her mother, Mary Teresa Leiter, understood the family's social ambitions in plainer terms than anyone else in the household, and she was the one who first took her eldest daughter across the Atlantic in search of a titled marriage. France was tried first and abandoned quickly. The Leiter women found French society self-centered and snobbish, by their own later account, and turned their attention instead to England, where the path proved easier than expected. An introduction arranged through the wife of the diplomat, Lyon Playfair, herself an American from Boston, led to a luncheon attended by the Prince and Princess of Wales, and Mary was presented to the royal couple by a duchess. After that single afternoon, her social life in London, as one account later put it, never looked back. It is worth noting how much groundwork had already been laid, quietly, by the time George Curzon ever entered the picture. A girl from Chicago, shepherded by a mother with a clear strategic eye, building the connections that would make a match like Curzon's not just possible, but, in the calculus of the era, almost inevitable. Mary was not, in this sense, unusual. She belonged to a recognizable generation of young American women, the so-called dollar princesses, daughters of new industrial fortunes sent across the Atlantic in search of titles their money alone could not buy at home. By 1895, the year Mary married, at least 9 of these transatlantic matches had already taken place, and by the 1930s the number would climb past 300, bringing with it, by some estimates, well over $1 billion in today's terms flowing from American industry into the depleted treasuries of the English aristocracy. It was not contrary to the era's own sentimental telling, a one-sided arrangement of greedy lords preying on naive heiresses. The system ran in both directions. American fortunes, built on factories and railroads and dry goods empires, carried no inherited prestige of their own, while a crumbling English estate, however cash-poor, could offer exactly the kind of old-world legitimacy that no amount of new money could otherwise purchase. Mary Leiter would become, in time, the most successful of all of them, the $1 princess who rose higher than any other American woman before or since. But the system that produced her marriage was already well underway long before she ever met the man she would marry. In 1890, when Mary was 19 and visiting London during the social season, she was introduced at a ball to a young member of Parliament named George Nathaniel Curzon. He was 31, 11 years her senior, a Conservative MP who had already represented the constituency of Southport for several years and stood as heir to the barony of Scarsdale. Where Mary was reserved and watchful, George Curzon was nearly the opposite, brilliant, restless, and almost pathologically ambitious. A man whose friends had been predicting since his university days at Oxford that he would one day become Foreign Secretary, perhaps even Prime Minister. One friend had written to him as early as 1891, hoping that when Curzon became Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, he would restore the vanished glory of England and decide the fate of nations. The kind of letter you write only to a man everyone already assumes is destined for greatness. He had spent the years before meeting Mary roaming the most remote and politically sensitive corners of Asia, Russia, Persia, Afghanistan, the Pamirs, collecting both expertise and a formidable reputation as one of the most travelled men in British politics. He was also beneath the polish, a man in physical pain almost nobody outside his closest circle knew about. A curvature of the spine left him in near constant agony, manageable only through a steel and leather corset he wore beneath his clothes, which made riding and standing for long periods genuinely difficult. It is tempting, looking back, to see in this detail something almost symbolic. A man who built his entire public self around an image of effortless command, while privately held together by an iron frame nobody was permitted to see. He would ask something similar, eventually, of his wife, that she hold up an image of effortless grace while something underneath her was quietly giving way. Mary, by her own later admission, fell for him almost instantly and almost helplessly. "I will have him," she is recorded as saying of Curzon, "because I believe he needs me. I have no shame." It is a startling thing for a 19th century debutante to say, not a confession of love so much as a diagnosis. She had looked at this brilliant, suffering, overextended man and concluded, with the same clear-eyed practicality her father had used to buy up burned real estate in Chicago, that she was the thing he was missing. Curzon, for his part, would later say he had never loved Mary Leiter more than in the moment he first saw her walk into that great assembly, though by his own friends' accounts his heart took rather longer to fully arrive than hers did. The days that followed passed, by Mary's own later description, in something close to a haze. The two met again soon after at a grand English country house, the kind of sprawling weekend gathering where the British aristocracy conducted half its courtships under the cover of croquet and long walks through carefully landscaped gardens. It was during one of those walks, in a private corner of the grounds, that George later admitted he had felt a strong inclination to kiss her, restrained only by the strict propriety expected of the age, a small, charged moment of restraint that the two of them would turn over in letters for months afterward. Soon they were exchanging what one biographer later called fevered letters and trinkets, the private currency of two people falling toward each other in a society that demanded they appear in public to be doing nothing of the kind. She did not yet know what she now knows we know, that the man she had decided to claim came with a reputation, among those who had watched him longer than she had, as someone considerably more practiced in matters of the heart than she was. Here is the foreshadowing, laid down early and plainly. This was not, on Curzon's side, a meeting of equal hungers. He was older, more experienced in matters of romance, frequently absent on parliamentary business, and a man whose ambitions would always eventually come first. Mary did not seem to mind this at the time, or if she minded, she did not let it show. She did not press him publicly. She did not demand he choose between her and the career that consumed him. She did not, so far as the record shows, ask for more than he was prepared to give. She had decided he needed her. What she had not yet calculated was the price of being needed by a man like George Curzon. What followed was not a public courtship, but a secret one, an engagement kept hidden for nearly 2 years before their wedding, a reflection, by most accounts, of Curzon's own careful calculation of how the match would be received as his political star kept rising. For 2 years, the two of them carried on a correspondence and a courtship largely out of public view, even as Curzon continued his expeditions abroad and his climb through Parliament. When his close friend Cecil Spring Rice was posted to the British Embassy in Washington in 1894, Curzon actually suspected him of trying to interfere with the engagement, a suspicion that says something about how guarded and how precious Curzon considered the secret to be. It was only in 1895, on his return from a particularly dangerous expedition into Afghanistan and the Pamirs, that Curzon publicly announced his engagement to Mary, daughter of the Chicago millionaire Levi Ziegler Leiter. The wedding itself, on the 22nd of April, 1895, was staged not in London, but in Washington, at St. John's Episcopal Church on Lafayette Square, within sight of the White House. It was performed by Bishop Talbot, with the rector of the church assisting, and it was, by every account, one of the great social events the capital had seen in years. There was a quiet, practical undercurrent to the union that the romance of the day tends to obscure. Levi Leiter settled approximately $1.5 million on his daughter, a sum that substantially eased the financial pressures Curzon had accumulated through an ambitious lifestyle that had long outpaced his income as a younger son of the aristocracy. It was in the precise economic sense that historians now use for matches like hers, a transaction as much as a romance. American capital flowing into an old and increasingly cash-poor English inheritance. But to reduce it to that alone would be to miss what both of them, in their own ways, seemed to genuinely feel. Whatever calculation underwrote the marriage, by every surviving account from those who knew them, the affection between Mary and George Curzon was real, and it deepened rather than dimmed once the wedding was behind them. They settled first at Kedleston Hall, the 18th-century Curzon family seat in Derbyshire, a Palladian mansion of marble fireplaces and gilded staterooms designed in an earlier generation by the architect Robert Adam. A house, in other words, built explicitly to overawe. The estate's grandeur was sustained, quietly, by the dowry Mary's father's fortune had provided, easing financial strains that had shadowed the Curzon family for years. Here was the cost beginning to show itself even before India entered the picture. Mary's money would prop up Curzon's world, and Mary's presence, her charm, her famous warmth in a society known for its coldness, would prop up his political career. That autumn, when Curzon stood for re-election to Parliament, many in Washington and London alike believed his victory owed more to his new wife's winning smile and irresistible charm than to anything he said from the platform himself. The arrangement that would define the rest of Mary's short life was already quietly taking shape. George would supply the ambition, and Mary would supply almost everything that made the ambition survivable: money, charm, devotion, and eventually her own deteriorating health. For 3 years, the Curzons lived the relatively ordinary life of a rising parliamentary couple. London in the season, Derbyshire in the country. 2 daughters born in quick succession, Irene in 1896 and Cynthia in 1898. Then, in the summer of 1898, the letter arrived that would change everything. George Curzon, at not yet 40 years old, was offered the Viceroyalty of India, the single most powerful unelected office in the British Empire outside the monarchy itself. He was made Baron Curzon of Kedleston to give him the necessary rank, and Mary, by simple virtue of marriage, became Baroness Curzon. And, far more significantly, Vicereine of India, a position that made her, for as long as her husband held office, the highest-ranking American woman in the history of the British Empire. She was now, officially, the second highest-ranking woman in the entire empire after the Queen herself. It was an almost unimaginable ascent for the daughter of a Chicago dry goods merchant. A Cinderella story. As one biographer would later put it, with the small but significant caveat that Cinderella's father in this case happened to be worth at least $20 million. The reality awaiting her in India bore little resemblance to a fairy tale, however magnificent the surface. The Curzons arrived in Bombay at the end of December 1898, to royal salutes and crowds lining the docks. The beginning of 6 years during which Mary would be expected to perform, almost without pause, the single hardest job available to a woman of her era: to be perpetually visible, perpetually gracious, and perpetually flawless, in a climate her body was never built to withstand, while her husband attempted nothing less than the wholesale reform of how Britain governed a sixth of the world's population. George Curzon arrived in India determined to remake it. He saw himself, by every account, in something close to a quasi-royal role, a reformer, convinced that only total personal command of every detail, from irrigation policy to the precise wording of a military officer's signature, could hold the empire's most valuable possession together. He worked almost universally by report, to the point of physical collapse, often into the small hours of the morning, reviewing papers by lamplight while his ailing spine screamed beneath its steel corset. Mary's role in this machine was not incidental. It was structural. The Viceroy needed a Vicereine who could host, charm, and manage the social architecture of an empire's outpost, because in British India, social architecture was political architecture. Who was invited to dine at Government House, who sat where, who received a personal word from the Vicereine, and who did not. These were not trivialities, they were instruments of rule, every bit as real as a treaty or a tax code. And the woman who decided who entered the room, who left satisfied and who left snubbed, held a kind of power that history rarely credits, because it left no paper trail of its own. The power, in other words, did not belong only to the man who signed the dispatches. It belonged, in its own quieter register, to the woman who decided, who got near enough to ask him for anything at all. The early years in India were, by most surviving accounts, genuinely happy ones, happier in some ways than the more cloistered life of an English MP's wife had been. Mary threw herself into the role with an energy that surprised even those who already knew her. She took a deep interest in Indian arts and crafts, keeping several of the country's best artists continually employed with commissions, reviving skilled traditions that had nearly died out under the indifference of earlier colonial administrations. She studied Urdu under a respected local tutor, determined not simply to perform graciousness from a distance, but to genuinely understand the culture she now, in some ceremonial sense, presided over. And she used her position, as few vicereines before her had, to push for something concrete. Alongside the Marchioness of Dufferin, she championed progressive medical reforms for Indian women, working to supply female doctors and hospitals specifically for women, at a time when religious custom meant many Indian women would not permit themselves to be examined by a male physician. She established what came to be called the Victoria Scholarships, raising more than £50,000 to fund medical education for young women. And a hospital bearing her name still stands in Bangalore today, one of the few traces of her own that outlasted her, separate from anything to do with her husband's name. It is worth pausing here on the small motif that would define how the public saw Mary Curzon, and that she herself seemed to understand and even, in part, to enjoy, the jewel that is not what it appears to be. She was, by universal description, strikingly tall and beautiful, a society favourite on both sides of the Atlantic, and in India that beauty was put to deliberate use as an instrument of imperial theatre. In 1902, Curzon staged what he intended as the defining spectacle of his viceroyalty. The Delhi Durbar, a vast and lavish pageant held to mark the coronation of King Edward VII, designed to project British permanence and power to the Indian princes and the watching world alike. At the state ball that crowned the festivities, Mary wore a gown that would outlive every policy paper Curzon ever wrote. It was made by the House of Worth in Paris, woven of gold cloth and embroidered with peacock feathers, with a single iridescent beetle wing stitched into the eye of each feather, wings so many guests mistook for emeralds that the dress fed its own legend, becoming a screen onto which observers projected every fantasy they held about the wealth of American heiresses and Indian potentates alike. It was trimmed with white roses, finished with lace, weighted further with a diamond necklace and a brooch of diamonds and pearls. It became known simply as the peacock dress, and it survives still, in a museum collection, the single most enduring physical artifact of Mary Curzon's life. A garment of dazzling artifice, designed to be looked at by thousands, containing within its embroidery a small and almost private joke, that what glittered like emerald was, on closer inspection, only the wing of an insect. The empire she helped stage was very good at the first kind of looking. It was far less interested in the second. Beneath the pageantry, however, the years of endurance had already begun, and they would prove far longer and far costlier than anyone watching the Durbar from a distance could have guessed. The job of Vicereine was not, whatever the gowns suggested, primarily decorative. It required Mary to maintain a punishing schedule of public appearances, formal dinners, and ceremonial duties through a climate that the British medical establishment of the day already understood to be dangerous to Western constitutions. Heat that did not relent, monsoon humidity that bred illness, and a level of physical and nervous strain that the role's male occupants were rarely expected to absorb in quite the same continuous, smiling, never-resting way. She did not complain publicly. She did not, by the accounts of those who served alongside her, allow her exhaustion to show in any official setting. She managed 3 pregnancies during her years in India, Irene and Cynthia born before the viceroyalty began, and a 3rd daughter, Alexandra, conceived in the summer of 1903 at the hill station of Naldera, reportedly after a round of golf played at high altitude, and born the following March. All of this while continuing to host, to travel, to charm visiting dignitaries, and write careful letters of advice to other society wives about exactly what headgear would be appropriate for the next state occasion. In one surviving letter from November 1902, written from the Viceroy's camp at Simla to Lady Randolph Churchill, Mary calmly advised her correspondent on precisely the right hat to wear in Delhi, and added that she would not need to bring her own ayah, since her maid would suffice. The small, almost absurd practicality of a woman managing an empire's social machinery in the same breath as she managed luggage and laundry. This is what the public saw: composure. What the public did not see, because Mary made certain they did not, was the toll being quietly extracted underneath. The wider world Mary and George were operating in during these years was not, beneath its ceremony, a stable or a comfortable one. The early years of Curzon's first term coincided with a famine that would eventually claim, by various estimates, somewhere between 1 and 4.5 million lives across India. A catastrophe Curzon responded to with relief works that fed several million people at once, alongside tax reductions and substantial new spending on irrigation, even as he insisted, in language that reads coldly today, that indiscriminate charity would weaken what he called the self-reliance of the population. It was the defining moral contradiction of his viceroyalty, a man capable of genuine, large-scale administrative compassion, who nonetheless filtered nearly everything through the cold arithmetic of imperial efficiency. Mary's own correspondence from these years shows comparatively little engagement with the famine directly. Her attention, by both necessity and by the narrow scope the role allowed her, stayed fixed on the social and ceremonial machinery she had been handed to run. It is one of the few uncomfortable truths the story does not resolve neatly, that the same system extracting an enormous cost from Mary's own body was simultaneously extracting a far greater cost from millions of Indians whose names no biography would ever record. Both were, in their different registers, casualties of the same imperial machine. Back at Government House in Calcutta, and later in the hill station palaces of Simla, the daily routine that the public never saw was relentless in its own quieter way. Mornings began with correspondence. Invitations to issue, replies to draft, the constant traffic of who would sit beside whom at that evening's dinner. A question that in British India carried the weight of actual policy, since a slighted Maharaja or an offended colonel's wife could complicate Curzon's work in ways no formal dispatch ever could. Afternoons brought visits, inspections of the hospitals and schools she had taken under her patronage, fittings for the endless succession of gowns a Vicereine was expected to produce for an endless succession of occasions. Evenings brought the dinners themselves, hours of standing and smiling and remembering names, performed in formal dress, in a climate that the era's own doctors already understood as dangerous to a European constitution, particularly through the long wet heat of the monsoon months, when illness moved through the British community of India with grim regularity. There is a reframing worth sitting with here, because it cuts against almost everything the era's own propaganda wanted people to believe. The conventional story of the British Raj at its height placed the Viceroy at the centre of every frame, the reforms, the durbars, the grand gestures of imperial will. But it was Mary who held together the human infrastructure that made all of it survivable. The relationships, the morale, the goodwill of officers' wives and visiting royals and Indian elites alike, accumulated dinner by dinner, letter by letter, gracious word by gracious word, with none of it written into any official record of the Viceroyalty's accomplishments. Lord Curzon would be remembered by history for restoring monuments and reorganizing armies. Mary Curzon would be remembered when she was remembered at all for a dress. The work that actually held the marriage and the office together left no monument of its own. By the end of Curzon's first 5-year term, Mary was pregnant with Alexandra, and by every indication ready and eager to go home. The plan, as she understood it, was to return first to England and then on to America to see her own family. But without consulting her, George chose to extend his viceroyalty for a further 2 years. She tried, by the accounts that survive, to talk him out of it. He would not be moved. It is a small moment, easy to pass over in the larger sweep of imperial history, but it carries real weight. A decision about the shape of both their lives, made by one half of the marriage alone, and absorbed by the other half without, so far as the record shows, any real recourse. So in January of 1904, Mary returned to England without him, while George remained in India to begin his second term. The breaking point, when it came, arrived not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation of crises that finally overtook both of them at once, one physical, one political, and each making the other worse. That summer of 1904 brought the birth of her daughter Alexandra in March, a moment of real joy. But the year would not stay kind. A prolonged and nearly fatal infection followed a miscarriage, compounded by the surgery that followed it, and Mary's health collapsed entirely. She fell gravely ill at Walmer Castle in Kent, so seriously that by September 1904, George, recalled urgently from India, was already, by his own household's later account, making arrangements for her funeral. And then, against every expectation, she recovered. George wept with relief and within weeks made his way back to India, because the business of the Viceroyalty could not simply pause for grief or gratitude. Several months later, an extremely weakened Mary followed him back across the world, because that too was understood to be part of what her position required of her. She would later say the warmer Indian climate genuinely seemed to help her recover. George, meanwhile, found his second term consumed not by the triumphant reforms of his first years, but by an escalating and increasingly bitter feud with his own commander-in-chief. The dispute, on its surface, was almost comically narrow. A disagreement over the precise administrative authority of a position called the military member of the Viceroy's Council, who oversaw arser supply and logistics. What began as a relatively minor bureaucratic disagreement between Curzon and Lord Kitchener of Khartoum escalated, over many months, into a major power struggle that eventually drew in the press of 2 continents. The 2 men had circled each other warily for years by this point. As early as 1904, Kitchener had proposed reducing the powers of the military department, and when Curzon paid the paper little heed, he discovered weeks later that Kitchener had quietly submitted the same proposal directly to the Imperial Defence Committee back in London, going over the Viceroy's head entirely. By the following spring, Kitchener had organised something close to a press campaign of his own, placing favourable accounts of his proposed army reforms in the Times and other London papers, building public pressure that Curzon, isolated in India, had no comparable means of answering. Curzon at one point even wrote to complain that Kitchener's habit of signing himself Kitchener of Khartoum took up unnecessary time and space, a complaint Kitchener, not unreasonably, considered petty, especially from a man who signed himself simply Curzon, as though he had been born to a peerage rather than created one. Beneath the pettiness, though, lay a genuine and consequential question about who actually controlled the army that held British India together, and it mattered enormously to both men's sense of their own authority. By the spring of 1905, the British cabinet in London had sided decisively with Kitchener's proposed reforms, eliminating the role Curzon had spent years defending. Unable to accept the change, Curzon submitted his resignation on the 12th of August, 1905. He left India that November bitter and resentful, denied even the customary honours typically afforded a departing viceroy. Here is the second reframing the story asks us to sit with. The empire Curzon had spent 6 years trying to govern through sheer force of personal will turned out, in the end, to run on something closer to office politics than on the grand vision either man liked to imagine himself serving. A disagreement over who signed which form, who controlled which supply depot, ended the career of one of the most capable administrators Britain ever sent to India, and Mary, who had given her health and her years to support that career, was left to watch it collapse over a dispute that history would later struggle even to explain clearly to students memorizing it for examinations. The power that mattered in the end was not the power either man believed himself to be wielding. It belonged to whichever distant committee in London decided, on a given afternoon, whose account of the matter to believe. For Mary, by every surviving account, this collapse of her husband's career, the thing she had spent 6 years of her health and her own ambitions supporting, was met with something close to relief rather than grief. She had been planning, even before the resignation came, a 3-month family stay in the south of France, a holiday from the relentless performance of imperial life that had defined her entire adult existence. No one, least of all Mary herself, understood yet that her body had already absorbed more than it could ultimately survive. The aftermath unfolded with a cruelty that no one watching from outside could have anticipated. Curzon returned to England a politically diminished man, excluded from the 1906 general election at the advice of doctors and the wishes of the king, finding himself for the first time in 2 decades without any office, any platform, any clear next act. It was, as more than one biographer has observed, the genuine nadir of his public life. And it was precisely at this moment, when George Curzon had, in a sense, nothing left to offer the world except his presence, that Mary's own body finally gave out the debt it had been quietly accumulating since Walmer Castle. She never fully recovered from the illness of 1904. The hot weather of the English summer of 1906 brought on what was described at the time as a pronounced attack of general debility. On the 18th of July, with 2 specialists summoned to her bedside and remaining until the end, the final cause of death was recorded as heart failure. Though everyone close to the family understood it as the long-delayed consequence of an illness she had never truly shaken. She died at home at 1 Carlton House Terrace at the age of 36. For George Curzon it was, by his own later description, and by the testimony of everyone who knew him, the single greatest loss of his life, a loss made sharper, not softer, by the timing. In later years, though he was neither a devout nor a conventional churchman, he sometimes said he was not afraid of death, because it would allow him finally to join Mary again. It is one of the few unguarded sentences the historical record preserves from a man famous for his polish and his pride, and it suggests something that the politics of his career never fully revealed, that whatever calculations had underwritten the marriage at its outset, by its end, Curzon had come to need Mary, in a way that went far beyond the political usefulness she had once, half-jokingly, diagnosed in herself at 19 years old. What he built next was an answer in stone to a question he could no longer ask her directly. He commissioned a memorial chapel, designed by the architect G.F. Bodley, attached to the parish church at Kedleston Hall. Not, despite what some later writers like to claim, a deliberate echo of the Taj Mahal he had spent his viceroyalty restoring, but built instead in the English decorated Gothic style, a monument rooted in his own country rather than borrowed from hers. He charged the sculptor Sir Bertram McKennell with creating a marble effigy of Mary for the tomb, instructing him to express, so far as marble could express such a thing, the pathos of his wife's premature death, and to make the work emblematic of the deepest emotion he could summon. The chapel took 7 years to complete. Mary lies there still, in the family vault beneath it, and when Curzon himself died nearly 2 decades later, his own effigy was placed beside hers. The two of them lying together in marble, in a way the demands of empire and office had so rarely allowed them to simply rest together in life. It is worth noting, almost as a coda, that Curzon's second wife, whom he married more than a decade later, chose to be buried not inside that chapel, but in the churchyard outside it, a small telling detail about which marriage in the end claimed the more permanent ground in his memory. There is something almost unbearably literal in the story of that monument, a man who, while she was alive, asked his wife to be a beautiful and ceaseless surface, radiant at every durbar, composed through every illness, finally building her once she was gone, an object whose entire purpose was simply to hold and display grief in marble for as long as the building itself might stand. The peacock dress had asked the world to look at Mary and see wealth and spectacle. The tomb asked the world to look at her and finally see the cost. There is a question every life built this close to power eventually asks, whether the person living it ever says it aloud or not. What exactly was given, and what in the end was given back? Mary Leiter Curzon spent 6 years of her health, 3 pregnancies, and very possibly the additional decades she might otherwise have lived, in service of a vision that was never, in any formal sense, her own to build. She did not write the policies. She did not sign the treaties. Her name appears in the official history of British India mainly as an aside, a hostess, a beauty, the wearer of a famous dress, even though the social architecture she built, dinner by dinner and letter by letter, was as essential to her husband's governance as any reform he ever signed into law. What Mary Curzon's life leaves behind is not a lesson about ambition, or about the dangers of marrying for love, disguised as usefulness, though both of those threads run through her story plainly enough for anyone who wants to draw them out. It is something quieter and harder to dismiss, the way history tends to remember the architecture and forget the load-bearing wall. Curzon restored the Taj Mahal and is remembered by his own country and by India's first Prime Minister alike as the viceroy who loved and preserved a civilization's beauty. Mary held together the human machinery that allowed him the time, the goodwill, and the political capital to do it, and what survives of her most visibly, in most retellings, is a gown. But the marble tells a truer story than the gowns ever did, if anyone takes the time to look at it closely. A man who did not believe in an afterlife in any conventional sense, nonetheless told people, late in his life, that death held no fear for him, because it meant he would see her again. He built her a chapel that took 7 years, because no amount of stone seemed sufficient to the debt. And when his own time came, he asked to be laid down beside her, not above her, not in some grander tomb of his own making, but simply beside her, the 2 effigies facing the same direction, finally given the one thing the demands of empire had never once allowed them while she lived, the stillness of lying still. together, with nowhere left to perform for. She had told a friend once, before any of it began, that she would have him because she believed he needed her, and that she felt no shame in admitting it. She was right about the need. She simply never lived to see how completely and how late he would finally admit it back. If you'd like more stories like this one, women who built empires they were never permitted to rule, consider subscribing for the next chapter.